Hello. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to our lecture series. Welcome to the events that IAAC is organizing within the Architecture Festival, the Model, one of the main activities that are happening in the city for the European Capital of Architecture, Barcelona 2026. And today we're very, very glad to have a very special lecture from a person that has been very close to IAAC for many, many years, but also from a person that very few days ago has been appointed as the new IAAC director, Daniel Ibanez. He has been an alumni at IAAC. We have been almost studying together for some years. He's a doctor from Harvard. He has been in the US for some years, and he has been always collaborating with IAAC, co-directing the master in ecological buildings and biocity. He has been working also with the World Bank in different kind of consultancy projects, and he's now back with us in Barcelona. So welcome on the one hand for being with us, but also welcome to the team of IAAC, and we're really looking forward to work with you. And we're also very much looking forward that today you share with us the work that you have been developing, a lot of research and projects in relation to timber design. Danny is also the author of the book, The Wood Urbanism, and some of this work and the theory and the practice behind it, I guess, will be shared with us today. So no more to add from my side. Thank you, Danny, for joining us for the lecture, and please help me welcome Dani Ibanez.
All right. So thank you so much, Areti. It's always a pleasure. Barcelona, I'm back, partially back. So very excited to be here. I think I never left, my mind never left Barcelona, but somehow this is hopefully the beginning of a new phase, a very exciting one. I feel like, as I will show today and share with all of you, I have carried many of the things that were cooked initially here at the IAAC in this very same building together with me in my other journeys, and hopefully I can also bring back some of the things I've been doing over the last decade actually abroad. So obviously, there are many things I could share today, but I thought in the context of the Barcelona Architecture Week, the context of what we are doing at IAAC, and also in the context of the ecological pressures of our time, I thought I would try to give a talk where I could somehow mix a little bit some of my research with some of my kind of professional world, but in a way trying to show or have one underlying idea of how design can really meaningful contribute to questions of ecology, with this idea of how design can help the challenge of global warming. So let me start, if this goes. Okay, so let me start with this image. I will do a small preamble of a little bit of the IAAC history, or my history at IAAC, if you guys will. This is basically what got me into the first place to know IAAC and to arrive, to this building a few years. This was the first edition of the self-sufficient housing competition. I did this over 3 or 4 weeks with my partners at the time in Madrid. We found that the topic was super interesting. We, spent days and nights kind of like drawing these kind of like ecological towers that in a way they were able to combine different processes of, energy harvesting, recycling, storaging, and that was the kind of ecological principle behind this design. Few months later, after doing this competition, we receive a very funny call that I have mentioned several times from Lucas Capelli, that at the time was the kind of organizer of this competition, also a board of trustees member here, basically saying that we won this competition and that we had the opportunity to come to IAAC. I will, make the kind of like a story short. For us at that time, we were not even considering moving to Barcelona, but we kind of like decided to do it. We met Vicente, we met at the time as well Willy, and we thought like, well, 1 year maybe will not kill us. Why not? Let's try to do that. The rest I would say is kind of like history. I've been, doing many things since then, and now with this challenging but also super exciting a kind of new role. So the two things I want to kind of, bring your attention to is like, one is this kind of ecological thing that brought us here in the first place. The second one is this other dimension, which is the one of timber and also kind of digital fabrication and advanced design that is very important here at IAAC. This is a picture of, for those of you that know, this is Tomás Díez and myself joining what it was at the time the first edition of the FAB Academy. This was a kind of like pilot testing or pilot a kind of year to see if we could have online education using the infrastructures that we have here, but having a kind of global network of know-how. This also funny image, I hope Areti is not embarrassed, is you will also recognize a very young Areti and very young Dani Bañez, also a very young Tomás Díez, and also for those of you that know her, very young Laia Pifarré, So this is actually in this very same space. The wall that you see on the back, is pretty much that wall, and this is circa, I don't know what, 2008 maybe, something along those lines. No, so again, just as a kind of reminiscence somehow of the past, but I want to put these two dimensions of my kind of previous history here, where these questions of digital fabrication, all the experiments that we did, all the kind of like innovation, bringing people from MIT, exposing ourselves to the world, is at the core of the opportunities that I have witnessed and I have been somehow exposed. No, last thing, and again, just to share a few things about this second topic of timber and digital fabrication. This was one of the exercises I managed to do in the FAB Academy. In that, this was my kind of final project, that I did this kind of tiny model that you see on the right, that then I put it there into its larger kind of like, version, which was this, that at the time, this was my kind of tiny house, kind of like apartment, trying to really not only designing, not only abstracting, but, designing with my own hands and really transforming space. So again, short kind of history of, some of the things that brought me in the first place, but I want you to hold these two ideas, the preliminary research we did on questions of ecology that I have carried throughout my time, and also this interest on timber and at the intersection with advanced design and manufacturing. So let me now shift gears to what I really want to share with you kind of like today, because this is obviously not about a kind of history of myself at IAAC, but really about important challenges ahead for us in the fields of design. So the way I have structured the talk is basically in I would say two parts. The first one, I will just simply introduce the framework that I have been using to kind of understand basically the world and understand the way I have to operate as a designer, which is around questions of urban metabolism. I will introduce then briefly wood, that for me has been a great metabolic flow, and I will explain that in a second. And then I want to show you three strategies visualized through many different projects, some of mine, some of the ones I've been researching on in several publications, of three strategies that I think could have a very important role in addressing questions of climate change and global warming. One is the possibility of creating more powerful feedback loops. The second one is how to basically downscale some of these crazy globalized processes that we have in the world, and a third one, which is a new way of rematerializing design. I'll explain those in due course. So let me start with the more heavy part. I hope you can bear with me a little bit in the first part. It's a little bit more dense, and then hopefully the later part becomes a little bit more explicit. So the first thing is I think this visualization is good just to convey one idea, that we tend to think that every time we say the word urbanization, we in our minds, kind of dream of big cities and the moment of agglomeration, right? The moment of like, big buildings and streets and urban kind of like density. But the reality is that those urbanization processes are supported by many other processes that are occurring in many different places. No? So the kind of two spheres that you are seeing on the back, right? If the left one is somehow saying like, the only part that is urbanized in the world is the one that has nighttime lights, no, the ones that are illuminated. But in reality, when we deeply start to analyze all the things that make possible that today we have a building, we have the material, we have the energy, we have all the processes that run those cities, we have an image that is closer somehow to the right, where landscapes of infrastructure, of mobility, areas of resource extraction are as fundamental for everything that we do as cities as the cities kind of itself. I like very much this quote from David Harvey, which is urban geographer, no? That he says that in a fundamental sense, there is nothing unnatural about Manhattan. Manhattan being probably the most dense moment of agglomeration, no? the most kind of urbanized place that we can imagine. But yet still what he's trying to tell us is that whatever things that we can find in Manhattan, they were a form of primitive nature in a previous stage. So what he's kind of pointing us is to really engage in a kind of dialogue and try to understand that everything that composes our city is the result of transforming nature. And that's where I want to go, of metabolizing nature in particular ways that, render, buildings and cities the way we understand them today. So as I'm starting to introduce, central to the kind of, in a way, to the challenge of describing cities in the one hand and all these other processes that are happening, quote unquote, outside cities, is this concept of urban metabolism, which is pretty much a research framework that is kind of like invested in describing these relations. No, that is, everything that goes from, any flow that you can imagine, questions of, material, resources, energy, people, try to, embrace them in a more comprehensive way. These kind of like transformations, these metabolic processes are characterized by the way, in general, material and energy flows circulate, right, or are metabolized. Basically cities taking a lot of resources from the biosphere and in a way returning them in a kind of linear fashion, which is the main problem that we are facing today, right? Rather than having these kind of circular loops, we have these very linear ones. We extract and we accumulate and we generate waste, happening this in a very, very linear kind of flow. And we know that, the consequences of those linear kind of metabolism is, things as you are seeing in the screen, such as, carbon emission, the proliferation of waste, the resource depletion, and many other things that in a way characterize these linear urban metabolisms. So the origin of these challenges, not to go too deep into kind of like history, can be in a way articulated in a concept that is related with metabolism, which is called the metabolic rift. So basically, as modern systems develop, right, you have here both France and Paris at the beginning of the kind of modernization, at the beginning of the Haussmannization process, and on the right-hand side, 30, 40 years later, when it fully developed, cities in a way experience a kind of like rupture where the interaction between somehow humanity and the rest of the biosphere was kind of like, pull apart. Before, everything was happening kind of close together in a kind of confined, we have the agricultural fields, we could have the cities, everything was happening somehow geographically located. And after modernity, one of the things that occurred is that this thing exploded. You were able to bring the materials from farther away. And that's in a way, very well visualized in this kind of like maps. These logistical networks were the ones enabling, this circulation of materials. And at the same moment, the visible somehow aspects of the city at the same moment became separated or dissociated from this world of kind of hidden metabolic, industries and pipes and technological network. No, so the city in a way say like, okay, we want to just show the clean, cool thing, and everything that somehow all the kind of the backstage that enables us to operate, you will push it aside, either far away or down below. Since then, since modernity, in general, urbanization processes and city has experienced a kind of a gradual upscale or upregulation. And what I mean by that is that, you know, somehow urban environments were becoming somehow more and more inefficient of places to accumulate a lot of energy, a lot of kind of like materials that were coming from farther and farther away at a higher kind of like a speed. The paradox is that while these kind of like, you know, ruptures were kind of like happening, people were less aware of that, you know, of that kind of like condition of things, you know, being absolutely kind of like globalized. If we look at today's predominant forms of response to these metabolic rifts, we see that, you know, they, you know, tend the risk of being a little bit commodified, and they're, you know, this kind of concepts of like, you know, green buildings and sustainable eco parks and the like. There is nothing, you know, inherently wrong with these approaches. The question is that these approaches could be great or could be terribly bad if they are not accounting for these interdependencies, for where they are bringing the materials from, for how they are kind of like, you know, running their kind of like operational energies and so on. So in a way, you know, and there are many people claiming this, some of these responses make this space in one side more comfortable, more domesticated, more cool, at the expense of transforming other places kind of like elsewhere. In part, this is because of, you know, a kind of like overemphasis on very specific sites. You know, as architects, we just tend to look at the building, you know, as the building as the main focus of our design, of our attention. But somehow this, if you will, theoretically and pedagogically, in a way, obscures all these interdependencies that happen at a broader scale. No, so as metabolism, you know, in general, metabolism analysis reveal, the construction of a building, for instance, you know, requires far more elaborate infrastructural systems, resources, people, processes that, you know, in many cases can extend hundreds of kilometers away from the actual place where the building somehow is accumulated, right? Additionally, if this plays, maybe don't. Okay, so additionally, urbanization has become a process of, you know, such an overwhelming complexity. You know, it's huge, it's vast, that you know, a single viewer looking at a single moment is, you know, cannot expect somehow to comprehend. No? So this you know, snapshot approach of perceiving urbanization make it very difficult for us also to kind of like trace and understand all these kind of like metabolic relationships. This video that you are seeing is part of the last Venice Biennale, where, you know, we were trying to explain this complexity and not just rendering you know, urbanization as equal to cities. So here, and with this, I will start closing the more theoretical part. So I hope you guys are still fine. You know, what to do against this background? What can design do? I mean, like, shall we keep designing our buildings, not caring about this connection? So maybe should we try to find a new way of designing in relation with these things that in the first place make architecture? So the question I kind of ask is, you know, how the framework, in this case of urban metabolism, can help us, you know, find new ways for design discourse and practice, to really try to fix these kind of ruptures of these metabolic ruptures associated with urbanization. That, as you guys know, they are directly responsible for questions of global warming and climate change. So for those of you that you know, are excited about these more theoretical questions, I did a book publication that is the one that you have behind, Grounding Metabolism, as part of a new geography series with my friend and colleague Nikos Katsikis, where we were really trying to deepen on this theoretical question posed by the metabolic framework. So, you know, as a wrap up of the theoretical part, you know, I think, in my view, that architecture and urbanism can play a huge role in the way these flows circulate, you know, around the planet, locally or territorially. We know that a construction of a building entails, you know, the transformation or sometimes the destruction of other landscapes. So I think when, as designers, we fail to recognize these connections, we somehow remain putting an overemphasis on questions of aesthetics or, or geometry or things that I'm not saying they are not important, but they need to be understood in relation with this other broader connection. So I hope that's what I can leave you guys with today. All the projects that I'll be trying to show, in a way, they are trying to not only taking care about the things that are meaningful for architects historically, but also designing with these external, processes in general. And the general kind of like goal behind this is, in a way, try to go from this linear metabolism into things that are more circular metabolism, where things start to be a little bit more ecological. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part, very briefly, I want to introduce, for those of you that maybe are not that familiarized, the new player that we have in the construction kind of like industry, the new player that is kind of hopefully meant to play a very key role, which is wood. And I want you to understand wood not just as a kind of in the form of particular construction commodity, but mostly as a flow. When I talk about wood, I talk about the tree, wood in the form of the tree, or wood in the form of a piece of lumber, or wood in the form of a wall, or wood in the form of a particular building, and so on. Will cities of the future be built with wood? Like this is becoming a very important topic today, even kind of like mainstream outside, design discourses. We know that recent technological developments are, in a way, and all the benefits associated with mass timber that I'll explain in a second, such as being, renewable, carbon storing, is kind of like repositioning this material at the very center of questions of, let's say, questions of the future of urbanization, but at the same moment about the ecology of urbanization. And why is that? In very simple terms, we have a material that is able to do two things at once. It's able to, produce materials to house an increasing population, but at the same moment, that materiality, it's able to kind of like deposit in a safe way and remove carbon from the atmosphere, of course, if it's done kind of like properly. You will be asking, okay, but we have had buildings made out of wood since the beginning of humanization. This is not something new. What has changed? What is new about this? So, in a kind of nutshell, one of the big changes is this type of construction commodity, what is called kind of mass timber, which is basically a series of new construction kind of products that enable to be a wall, enable to be a slab, enable to be a facade. It's structurally, it's also a good insulation material, but simultaneously it's acting ecologically. It's storing a carbon in probably one of the safest places on Earth. With this materiality, we have seen very tall buildings done recently. This is one in Norway, 85 kind of like meters high, and it seems that the kind of tendency is to keep having more of these buildings and even reaching higher higher numbers. The other I would say not exclusively associated with mass timber, but one of the very important dimensions is the prefabrication role of mass timber, right? I mean, many of the construction systems, for instance, the ones that we have in Spain, they tend to rely less on prefabrication, and it's mostly an on-site. I mean, with mass timber, one of the pretty interesting paradigm shifts is that most of the heavy lifting occurs in a factory. It's mostly off-site, and then when the materials arrive into the specific location, it's mostly a choreography of putting the pieces together. This speeds up the processes of construction, reduces risk, reduces noise, pollution associated with constructing this kind of materials, right? And again, in addition to that, wood is so flexible, so connected with many of the things that IAAC has been historically doing of questions of digital fabrication. Is such a flexible material that can enable, many different forms of innovation. So to wrap up, this quick introduction about, the role of mass timber, as Areti was mentioning, most of these kind of like efforts were published in this book that I did with two of my friends and colleagues, Kiel Mo and Jane Hutton, that was called Wood Urbanism. And probably more important in the context of today is the subtitle, which is From the Molecular to the Territorial, with this idea of connecting the whole value chain of what it takes to make, in this case, a building through the understanding of a particular wood flow. So the book, just to give you a short glimpse, tries to acknowledge the benefits of in this case, of mass timber, but tries in a way to avoid falling into the trap of generic wood. Again, having a building that is made out of wood could be great or could be terribly bad. I mean, it depends in this case and in the context of this talk on what were those metabolic relations, or what were those interdependencies that is inherent. To put an example, if we are to build a building here that the wood is coming from the Amazon that has been illegally forested and has been manufactured in Melbourne and then shipped again to Barcelona, that would be a terrible, anti-ecological building. If the building instead is, sourced from a sustainable forest nearby, manufactured kind of like locally, maybe we are really starting to enter into a really, advanced and true ecological building. So basically the notion that the book is trying to push forward is this idea of not just simply considering anything that is made out of mass timber something good, but something that has, metabolically specific wood relations, that really you are taking care of the full kind of like process and value chain. Okay, so three, let's say, quick chapters from here, 3 strategies that I want to leave you with about, in this case, basically metabolic approaches that in a way saying, ecological approaches where wood can play an important role. So first one, this idea of feedback loops, right? Why wood has the potential of being a powerful feedback loop. Yeah, I think this drawing exemplifies it relatively well, even though it's obviously a simplification. No? But basically, forests grow, and while they are growing, they absorb huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere. If they are sustainably managed, you can extract a lot of material, enable the space in the forest for another forest to kind of grow and sequester more. And that materiality, as long as it stays being a material, meaning it's not burned or it's not decaying, the CO2 will always remain there. So if you think about it, what would be the best space to store this type of materiality? Probably a building. A building has a pretty long life. It could potentially be disassembled and reused later on. So again, one of the potentials of mass timber, if done properly, is about this circularity. My good friend, Alan Organsky, these days, Director of Innovation of Bauhaus the Earth, has a contribution in the book that basically, tries to kind of like summarize what has been the kind of history or the recent history of urbanization in these kind of like 3 different phases, right? I mean, like a phase, kind of major process of urbanization of the carbon pool formation, where basically, trees were just simply absorbing carbon and creating these deposits. Then we have entered in this kind of carbon pool depletion, all that carbon that was stored over many, many years in the form of kind of fossil fuels that we have extracted to kind of like fuel the way we'll build. And hopefully the phase that we should be kind of like, entering now, which is, under this idea of the carbon pool replenishment. So stop burning those fossil fuels and really try to do a form of building that could again store more, where materialities such as steel or concrete that are very fossil fuel dependent are in a way replaced for renewable sources such as mass timber and many others. Why this is important in the context of global warming and a warming planet? Well, this is again not architects saying it. This is scientists of they keep giving us warning signals that that 2 degree, even 1.5 degree threshold in the global warming could have really fatal consequences in terms of the biodiversity of the planet. And if we don't do anything, we will be in the line that you see up there. Some of them say in 2036. It could be a little bit soon, a little bit later. Adapting a scenario where we start systematically using biomass as the main form of construction could help us push that date farther. And only if we were to really implement a global mass timber scenario properly done, maybe that's the only way to revert the system. So I'm not going to spend too much time. I think I already kind of like described, but I want you to take the, quickly the idea that, that's the machine that nature is offering us. It's a great machine, the forest, if it's, done in the proper way. And again, in a sustainable way. Develop a little bit more deeply, and I don't want to spend too much time because this might be a little bit complex, but I just wanted to share with you one simple idea. We tend to think that not cutting a forest will store or will remove more carbon than an actually actively managed forest. So this is basically what all the scientists, forest engineers are telling us, is that that's really not true. The more we basically harvest in a sustainable way a forest, the more carbon we're kind of absorbing. What you see in that line, that this kind of like spiky line, is basically all the times that you are harvesting the forest, and this line here, this kind of orthogonal line, is basically the carbon sequestration that you can have in a span of 100 years versus not touching the forest, just leaving the forest as it is. So you see that, properly managed forest, it is probably the only very little options that we have in this context. But again, as I was mentioning, this has to be geographical. We have to do this in a way that we account for the footprints. We really take into consideration where things come from and how much energy and emissions are embedded in the process. For the skepticals in these, I mean, I always like to use this recent news or relatively recent news from our neighbor France, that they have put in place, in this case, a policy that basically is stating that from the end of this year, every publicly subsidized building from the French Republic in France will have to be built with, at the very least, 50% of its materiality with coming from renewable sources, which in a way is pointing to having the structure made out of mass timber. So again, we have to see the implications of this. This is actually something that has been kind of like approved, but if a policy like this one were to be implemented in Barcelona, this would mean that every single building from now on will have to be built with this materiality. It's a huge change, and this is happening right across the border. The last quick thing before I enter in the examples of feedback loops and how design kind of plays a role there. Again, I want to clarify that when we refer to the forest, there is no one single forest. There are many types of forests. We have, from in the right hand side, we have plantations, we have old growth forests, and again, this is not about putting in questions of biodiversity. They has to be done in a way that is sustainable, and there are practices out there that tell us that this is basically the way to go. So let me put you 3 examples or 4 examples about potential feedback loops. One, as a consequence of the tsunami in Japan in 2011. Among the many consequences of a tsunami, one was that those trees that you see on the right, that when the roots are flooded with salt water, the tree is meant to die. And if nothing is to be done with that tree, it will decay and release the carbon back to the atmosphere. So in this case, Tezuka architects, Japanese architects, one of my favorites, decided to, try to do something quickly with those trees while their structure was good before they were kind of like decaying. So they kind of like propose to build basically a kindergarten for the local town with the materiality of those trees. Basically, again, creatively, doing a kind of feedback loop, but they did it in a very special way, especially because from a kind of design perspective, they tried to really leave the timber exposed in a way that was creating a connection with those kind of like diseased trees. But simultaneously, the kindergarten was done also as a refugee for future feedback loops. So if you think about it, I mean, here is not only about, how beautiful the design is or how warm does it feel or how open the floor plan is, which are important things, but in addition is, using a materiality that is keeping the carbon and is making something extremely powerful with it, which is a place for educating kids, but also a future refugee for future tsunamis where they can kind of go. No? So again, I could share with you many different examples. I'll share a few more, but I think this speaks of a completely different ecological awareness. You know, the architect here is not trying to make just the best building, but really trying to understand all these, in this case, relations, right? The second example I want to show you, this is what, you know, British Columbia is suffering quite a lot these days due to kind of global warming. Again, not a surprise for any of you, but among the many consequences of global warming is that this beetle, this insect that is in a way native to the forest, and it has a function. This actually, you know, in British Columbia, this beetle, what it does is, like, during the warm months of the year, it basically kills the old trees by infecting the sap as a way of regenerating the forest naturally. But this thing, the problem is that with global warming, because the temperatures are going up, this beetle used to die during the winter and only survive very few for the next year to repeat the cycle. But now, because the global warming is you know, increasing the temperatures, this insect is multiplying. So the effects of multiplying, as you guys could imagine, is, you know, massive amounts of forests basically dying, because the natural mechanisms of for the forest in this case is interrupted, right? Here are some of the maps that, you know, this has become a big problem. So again, how can design tap into this, you know, issue, into this problem? One good example among the many that I could again show is this Wood Innovation Center, where basically they say, like, look, we can be apologetic about that our forests are dying, and we have to put in place all the measures that we can. But in the meantime, the more of that timber, of that diseased timber that we extract and we don't allow it to decay, the more we will safely kind of like store. So basically this building, many of its components, maybe many of its parts, was done with this type of, a pine beetle, diseased kind of like tree. So again, just to the point of this chapter of feedback loops, again, if nothing is to be done, that will be bad for the forest, and also you will have to use another materiality that you would need to extract somewhere else. No, so thinking in these circular logics, I think it's it's particularly relevant. Third example about these feedback loops, and this connects with this idea of the metabolically specific wood relations, is the idea that, again, we have many different species. We don't have just one type of tree, we have many of them, right? And in a way, how can architecture also engage with that? So this is a beautiful example of a school in New Haven that Alan Organsky did a few years ago, where, you know, they were trying to specify all the different needs of the building with the right species that could be supplied by the, in this case, by the local kind of like region, right? So using particular hardwoods for natural kind of cladding of the building, some, you know, more softwood fibers maybe for the structure, some others for the interior cladding. So basically having a diverse collection of species that in a way will trigger that the forest has to be diverse to meet, in this case, the demand. No? So again, this is another form of feedback loop where you are not just thinking, okay, which wood I like the most and looks cooler in my renderings and my images, but trying to think like, well, maybe I have to have a diverse multi-species project as a way of ensuring that the production of these species it's maintained diverse. If we only build with pine, we will only have pine plantation, right? I mean, I think the logic is relatively obvious. I want to show maybe as the last one on this idea of feedback loops, a project I did recently in Madrid. These are some administrative office in an existing kind of building. This was more like kind of like interior design. We tried to say like, okay, mostly we have a commission here, we have to do a project, but we tried to create a culture for this. It was a family office and the headquarters for a winery, and we tried to, in a way, create a response that was sustainable, but not sustainable in the way that looks sustainable, but really trying to implement a series of processes that they could be in a way proud of. No, so again, nothing in particular that I want to go through, but this is the kind of a plan of it. It's a relatively kind of like large space. where basically we inserted this kind of like base with the kind of podium all done with chestnut from Asturias, which is a region in the north of Spain, very characteristic to do that because of the kind of properties that we have. So we were very conscious about, you know, going to meet the manufacturing, understanding how the forest was in this case like a harvest, what were the things that they put in place. We asked the manufacturers in this case, you know, where were the different sites that they were kind of like extracting under which kind of like particular conditions to really, you know, make sure that the final design could, you know, again, understand and respond to where it was, you know, originally a source. Just to, you know, again, I could tell probably several things about this, but, you know, I want just to give you a quick anecdote that I think was very representative of this, is that, you know, in this case, our proposal of bringing this natural materiality as being one of the key drivers of the design, we even kind of like designed this kind of, you know, wineries and so on, is that, you know, later in the process, because they were so understanding of these three species, they decided to actually, you know, do one of these sorry for the picture, it's a very low res, but they decided to do a wine barrel with this chestnut. So they typically use oak for doing that, but just because the space was done with chestnut, because it was coming from this sustainable forest management, they decided, like, can our space where we host the administration of the winery also affect the way we do the wine? So I think, again, this maybe is a less of an ecological feedback, but it's also a kind of a socio-cultural one that I think is relevant also to consider. Okay, so chapter 2, this idea of downscaling. So if in chapter 1, let's say I have tell you ideas into how design can tap into these connections, my goal in this second one is to show you initiatives that are occurring that are trying to bring closer these processes that are extremely globalized, right? Instead of saying like, oh, I bring the steel from China because it's cheaper, and I bring my whatever, you know, materials from far away because it's the price of the market. How can we, through design, start to bring back some of these, you know, very upscaled kind of processes? I will not go into the detail of this diagram. It will take me a while, but just I want you to hold this idea in mind that, you know, today urbanization has also become relatively specialized. We have, you know, areas of mostly accumulation, the big cities that we know, but we have a lot of areas, you know, of urbanisms of extraction. We have urbanisms that are mediating areas of extraction, those that are called cascade urbanization, those, you know, cities that has become very specialized to a particular kind of like industry. We have very speculative forms of urbanization. So all I want to say is that cities also are very diverse and very different, and that each of them has positioned itself in the global kind of commodity chain playing a role. So the question I want to kind of ask in this second chapter is there a way of bringing them closer together? Do we really need to have the production of bananas happening, you know, in the other side of the world, and the water coming from Fiji, and the, you know, whatever, the energy coming or traveling from far away? Is there a way that through our design we can start to, you know, have more autonomous and downscale buildings? So let me show you a couple of examples of things that are starting to occur and where can design play a role. So of course you will recognize this type of images. This is Detroit that suffer a huge you know, population loss after the you know, transition from Fordism to kind of like post-Fordism. So this has created the following questions, like how Detroit is going to promote anything if there is no demand, if there is no people, right? And in this graph, I think you will see very clearly that, you know, this is what it used to look in the 1950s, you know, a neighborhood in Detroit, and probably that's what it looks, you know, let's say today, right? Very few houses and mostly empty lots. So the funny part that has occurred here is that real estate developers, that they own the land, they own this kind of plot. They say like, well, we cannot promote, there is not going to be a demand. What can we do with our land? So believe it or not, they have implemented the largest urban forestry project. The same way they are like plenty of agricultural, let's say, fields and urban orchards that we find in cities, these guys have implemented basically plantations. Why the plantations need to be so far away? Why cannot we bring them there, engage the community, and have an economic kind of return right at the center of what we are consuming? So picking up on this initiative, is very relevant the work of Albert Pop and Jesus Basallo that they presented few years ago in the Venice Biennale. Also, they have a beautiful article in the book I mentioned before, where they were trying to say, like, well, is there a way, is there a form of urbanism where we can, you know, live together areas of, in this case, production, such as, you know, plantation, with the areas of accumulation, let's say the kind of buildings, with industries to transform them all together, kind of close by? Why do we need to have the forest very far away and the factories very far away? Can this, you know, create a new form of urbanization? So they created this kind of 50-year kind of master plan, where the more they were producing, the more they were kind of like creating, as again, as a way of, you know, bringing closer all these kind of processes, but also creating a new form of let's say, master planning that is not drawing a final image of what you want, but rather a process that, you know, gradually fulfills in time. Another example that I like very much is also the work of Stefano Boeri. Not too much the, you know, Bosco Verticale towers, which I think, you know, to some degree they are like they are kind of nice, but especially the work he did in Milano under the research project of Bio Milano. In there, basically, he is kind of like proposing this you know, big metropolitan kind of forest to be kind of like productive, that again follows the same principle I have already described a couple of times. You know, how can, you know, architecture be closer together with the landscapes of transformation and production, no? To again create situations that are closer like this, you know, like you have the housing with urban orchards, with the factory kind of like nearby, with the plantations kind of like local. You know, from a, of course, from an ecological perspective, makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it's not the only factor in play, but again, I think in a way shows the way to go. So again, to share also a little bit of my work, on, in this case, our work, and I'm super happy to have in the audience many of the co-conspirators of this initiative behind. This is a housing tower that actually it's undergoing. Hopefully we will break ground at the end of the month. This is a project I did with my friend and colleague Vicente Guayart, that basically is going to be the tallest, hopefully tallest social housing mass timber tower in Catalonia for sure, and maybe in Spain. We have to double check about that. The reason that I want to explain this project is also in the context of this idea of downscaling, you know, like, okay, how, not on the urban scale as we saw in the other project, but also at the building scale, what are the things that we can start reincorporating back into the city? So to go very quickly on this project, these are like 40 kind of like units, all done with, in this case, structure with mass timber. One of the very important things I want to say, and we have also here with us Gerard, is that these initiative was a very special one, and maybe I want to take 1 minute to describe it, because I think it's as important as what, let's say, us designers are trying to do to move the needle and to advance the transformation of the built environment. So the reason that we managed to win this competition with a mass timber building was not only because the architecture was probably the the best it could be, but because in this competition the criteria to select basically the winners slightly changed from other competitions. So typically these design and build kind of projects, they measure the economic proposal and the architectural quality. Those two dimensions are the ones that typically decide who gets the commission. In this particular case, they decided to add 2 other dimensions. They said like 30% will go to the quality of the architecture, 30% will go to the time of assembly, so the total time of construction, indirectly pointing to obviously questions of prefabrication. The third one was the carbon emissions associated with the actual manufacturing of the building itself, with the process of construction, and then giving only 10% to the economic budget. So if you think about about it, if they are telling you the more carbon negative building with the faster time of construction, indirectly this is pointing to prefabrication. And if you need to be carbon negative, mass timber is probably the best kind of like candidate. So again, these kind of projects and possibilities are enabled also with public policy and kind of in this case progressive city halls that are willing to again push the needle. So let me tell you very quickly the reason why I want to bring this particular project in the context of downscaling. So yes, it's a kind of mass timber building, 40 units, as I said. But in here we are doing huge amount of effort with many people, including Xavier Fincias, representing Sorige, which is the construction company that will be basically that we are doing the project with. Basically, we're inserting two other things. On this thing on the rooftop that you see, that is going to be a greenhouse that aims to produce all the food that is necessary, all the vegetables that are necessary for the community throughout the year, but also with a solar roof, a PV solar roof that also could produce the energy. And also, in addition to that, we are hoping that this could have in the first floor, we are in advanced negotiation to have a fab lab. So our goal with this building is not just simply say, okay, we are creating a mass timber building that hopefully is going to be built with local, kind of mass timber, hopefully at the very least from Spain, but also we are making it, able to produce energy, to produce food, and also to be able to produce and manufacture your own things. No, so again, the building is less a form of accumulating, let's say, materials, and in this case being also the source of producing, energy, goods, food, and other things. No, so anyways, I will go very quickly to some of the images of this thing. This is a little bit work in progress still, but we're very excited that in a way this building could holistically, not just because it's a mass timber building, help reinforce this idea of the downscaling, of bringing things closer together. Of course, for those of you that know a little bit the work that we have been doing also at IAAC, we did a little prototype about these things. This is the solar greenhouse. This is the project that we did with the students of the Master in Advanced Architecture and Advanced Ecological Buildings and Biocities in Baidaura last year. That we have, for those of you that know Baidaura, we have there a fantastic site to do all these kind of experimentations, and we always feel that our work in Baidaura with our students is meant to do seeds or small prototypes of a larger interventions in the city. So this kind of greenhouse, as part of this effort of kind of downscaling in itself, is a good example of how to design with these kind of ideas. No, as you see here, most of the timber that it would require to be built was kind of like very kind of like close by, or trying to maximize the kind of like proximity. It's 2 levels. It has germination on the top, on the bottom, and then mostly the greenhouse on the top, with also a few of these solar cells on the roof, with the idea of producing producing food and producing energy as well. And one of the beautiful things about this idea of the downscaling is that in Baidaura, we also, have the capacity of also locating the exact tree where, the material was extracted from and kind of color coded. So really, in this case, it's the opposite of a globalized form of urbanization. It's probably the super kind of like local minimal one. So with those ideas, I was just, I just simply want to, again, reinforce the idea of, can architecture, can design start bringing those things? I think so. I mean, I think the few of these examples at least show a little bit the way. Okay, last chapter, last idea about how to design with these larger processes, larger metabolic interdependencies, is this idea of rematerialization. I will use this diagram from the New Geographies book that I showed at the beginning from my friend Kiel Mo, to basically put the question of, are we kind of in a way ready for embracing a form of a building that is more closer to a monomateriality rather than having this, you know, infinite bundle of multiple materials? So basically, you know, he uses this to basically say that, you know, these days when we, you know, specify a facade, it's, you know, the compositions of thousands of different layers, water barrier, insulation, rain screen, the structure, the interior finishes. It's like the accumulation of thousands of them, when in reality, if you think about it, you know, one thick wall of timber, it can give you the structure, it can give you the insulation, it can give you an interior finishing, it could potentially give you the exterior finishing. So, you know, we tend to over specify these in questions of operational energy without considering the embodied energy, no, all the energy that comes from understanding all these kind of like processes. So this is in a way what I want to tackle in this kind of third chapter, saying like, well, maybe when we put everything into context, we should probably go, you know, closer to, sorry, the left hand side rather than in the right one. So let me show you a couple of examples. This is Svartlamoen. This is a building in Norway, one of the very first one that was done in social housing with mass timber, that I think is a really great example. I love this image. Is super, you know, again, not photographed, not cool, with a lot of stuff, but I think it's very representative of the possibility, right? In this case, you see a CLT panel doing the counter, is doing the wall structurally, but it's also doing the wall as an insulation, but it's also, you know, the interior kind of like finish, but the same wall is also doing the kind of like a slab of the you know, of the unit. So you have pretty much one material that is enabling you to do pretty much everything you need without relying on many different kind of like materials, right? Again, because it's Norway and it's cold, it also have a little bit of insulation, but pretty much it's a kind of monomaterial approach to architecture. And you will be asking like, but why? You know, maybe it's so boring, or why it's important to maybe go for that? Again, it's just when you put this, you know, material ecology of what it takes. So imagine, for instance, that, you know, you have 25 different materials in one facade. This requires 25 industries with 25 trucks, with 25 areas of production. So by also reducing the amount of materials we use and use them in a more, let's say, in a smarter way, we also could, you know, help reduce these, you know, big footprints associated with construction. A project of the house, you know, which I obviously like very much, that we did a few years ago. This is the Endesa Pavilion in its version for the Triennale in Oslo, that they kind of like asked us, and we were saying like, well, is monomateriality incompatible with also design and adding, you know, particular shapes and other processes on top? And absolutely not. I mean, I think this is also a great example of where, you know, the same wall could not also offer insulation and a structure and kind of cladding and interior finish, but also it could offer shade in summer and allowing the sun to go into inside the building in winter, and also at the same moment, you know, kind of like harvest energy. You know, so as some of you know, this was built in the port of Barcelona a few years ago. Last but not least, that I think it's also, you know, very important. I was talking today about, you know, our forest campus up in Collserola. This is kind of Baidaura, where another, I think, great example of this idea of how one material, if done properly, could pretty much solve all the architectural needs. So this is the project not of last year of our students, the year before. This is the box cell. We did a quarantine cabin for somebody to spend 14 days living, quote unquote, self-sufficiently there and quarantining before joining the community of Baidaura. Here are all our students, where I think, Alex, you should be somewhere there. Yeah, right there in green in the middle. Our my coordinator, Kaya, I think maybe you are there as well, somewhere. You are not? Okay. Anyways, Michael and few others. No, and again, Bruno is there as well. Sorry. Well, everybody's here. So, but again, two interesting things about this idea here of rematerialization. In here, you see that, you know, we are using timber as the interior finish, as the structure, as the primary form of insulation, even though we use also kind of like cork, and also in the kind of like rain screen. So for those of you that don't know, one of the very interesting things from a pedagogical point of view is that in Vidaura, we can do the full process. I mean, the students log the tree, dimension it, dry it, process it, and they did pretty much all the different steps into you know, making the building itself. And then, you know, in this case, even to put the kind of this idea of the rematerialization even one step forward, what you see here as the exterior kind of cladding of the building, these were the kind of leftovers of dimensioning the timber. You know that the timber always have this kind of edgy, you know, with you know, edgy boundaries, and normally is a residue, is a waste of the dimensioning kind of like process that the students kind of brilliantly collected, you know, parametrically kind of like design and did this beautiful facade using this sosugi technique, Japanese technique, to kind of like naturally insulate it. No? So again, I think it's a beautiful example of how with one material properly done, using all the different parts and components of it, you can you know, have a form of architecture that's truly ecological. It's not relying on a lot of industries, it's not relying on a lot of footprints. All right, so the very last thing that I want to offer you as a kind of way to wrap it up is this this idea of the agonistic aesthetics that I will show in a minute. No, my fundamental goal today was show you these three ways that, you know, again, design can you know, can have in order to advance towards more ecological solutions. But I want to also be a little bit provocative towards the end and challenge as well some of the other things that are happening today, hopefully to, you know, create alternative, more creative ways. So one thing that occurs very prominent with the industry is that we are seeing this type of approaches. What you see on the left is the SOM Chestnut Apartments that was done in Chicago several years ago. And the same firm, in this case SOM, decided to do the exact same design, but using only mass timber. So the whole exercise here was saying, like, we can prove that we can make this tower as it was exactly with mass timber. Again, this was mostly an engineering exercise, but I think it's very symptomatic of a problem that, you know, today we have a lot of people just pushing for swapping the materiality, as if that was all that was at the stake, right? Changing concrete for mass timber, and that's end of the story. And we know throughout the history of architecture that, you know, that's insufficient. You know, like aesthetical change comes from industrial, cultural, social kind of like changes. And I think we should aspire for more. So I always like to, in a way, end this kind of like talks with opening a little bit the imaginary of things that we can, you know, we can potentially do. I like, you know, I have selected few examples that I think they convey more strongly the possibilities with mass timber, rather than, again, this notion of just simply swapping and say like, oh, not ecological, oh, ecological because it's made out of mass timber. No, again, that's again not metabolically specific, it's not enough. So a few examples. This is a project by Pretz studio that they did in kind of like Toronto, using you know, this mass timber that again is conveying a completely different aesthetics about the building. Even a more radical one from my friends of Ultramodern. They teach at RISD, where I was teaching there for a couple of years, that they proposed this tower that is called Speculatius, that basically they were not proposing towers made out of timber. Basically, they propose solid towers of timber to be inserted in cities as kind of like monuments of carbon storing. So, you know, they were inserting this couple of cuts to create some form of public space, but the rest was meant to be, you know, full timber, saying like, well, if this is the process we'd have to embrace to remove the carbon from the atmosphere, let's give it an architectural expression. Or again, I'm just trying to be a little bit provocative here, but also, you know, this is the bank of Nordland. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this project from Anders and Berenson architects, where they propose this kind of cubic kilometer of stacked timber as a way of saying that this would represent the total harvest of, in this case, of the Nordic kind of countries in Europe as the main strategy to again remove carbon and allow all the landscapes, all the productive forest landscape to keep absorbing more carbon and meaningfully storing them here. So the last thing and the last concept I want to introduce is this idea of the agonistic ecology, so agonistic aesthetics that I was kind of like mentioning. I always used to introduce that the work of Joseph Beuys. Joseph Beuys, when he did this installation in the Documenta de Castel, what he really wanted to do was to install a movement of tree plantation in cities. He wanted to engage citizens to have a massive strategy of planting trees and reforesting the cities. This is what he wanted to do. The interesting thing of Beuys in this context is that rather than taking the, let's say, the smooth way, saying like, oh, trees are very important, let's plant them, let's convince everybody to join us in this effort, he did the opposite. He said like, I'm going to create a form of conflict that hopefully will trigger this change automatically. The form of conflict was that he basically managed to get funds to get these huge basalt stones, flood the plaza in the front of the Documenta de Castle with all of those that generated a lot of conflict. People saying like, we have the plaza full of stones, we need to remove them. This has not to be here. And he said like, well, for every tree you plant, we will put one of those basalt stones with the tree and we will empty out the square. Believe it or not, this has become one of the major initiatives of urban tree planting throughout the world. And it started with a form of kind of conflict. That's why the agonism kind of like terms comes. It's like sometimes the way to change things is not just simply saying all the good things, but maybe creating a form of friction, if you will. A couple of examples in this idea, this is Max Paintner kind of drawings that, he was trying to convey this idea that we have forgotten nature, no? Like cities are depicted as something gray with kind of a smoke. And, he was bringing the spectacle of nature back, as if we have forgotten that these productive landscapes, kind of don't exist kind of like anymore, no? Again, creating this tension, this kind of like agonism again, and bringing, a forest into, in this case, into a stadium. No, this was done by an Austrian architect kind of recently. Or, my last example from, let's say from outside that I always like to talk about is, these are called spruce facilities. When I discovered them, I was like very shocked because for those of you that are not familiarized with them, this installation, basically what they are doing is exposing the tree that you see inside here with CO2 levels of the future. Basically, this tree is basically breathing the CO2, the atmospheric CO2 that it would be exposed if we continue with these, emissions, basically in 15 years. And then my question is like, okay, why I have never heard of these installations, why they are so hidden. This actually will have to be in the city, right? It would be potentially very productive that we walk, and instead of seeing a perfect tree and a perfect park, we see these forms of nature dying. So hopefully they create some awareness, they create some change. People will be maybe more aware rather than these climate change things that, oh yeah, we keep hearing, but maybe we don't feel it or we don't perceive it in real time. So my contribution to that, and this is the last slides I will show in this genre of creating this form of agonism, is an installation I did in Boston 5 years ago in the context of the Boston Biennial, where I wanted to, in a way, create an installation that could speak about the full kind of, flow of transformation of the material, also exposing, cut trees, hopefully, creating some form of awareness. I don't know if as radical as Beuys, but, in a way, trying to jump on that boat. So again, conceptually, the project was very simple. I was trying to say like, okay, I'll show the different stages of transformation, from more raw to more engineered, from more natural, let's say, to more quote unquote kind of like artificial. No? And this was kind of like the result of the installation, how those trees in its kind of more pure form kind of like starting to converge and kind of like generate a kind of public art, kind of like installation. The kind of history behind, and I think this is a good example to finish because wrap up some of the ideas. It was try to source species of trees that are native to, in this case, to kind of like Massachusetts, that all of them comes from people that don't want their trees in their yard, and they call companies to remove a tree, and they put them trees here, and there is nothing productive being done. So I thought this was a good way of visualizing that kind of like process, temporal process, extracting them, exhibiting in a particular way, and then returning the flow that they were having. So here are some of the image of the design. I was very lucky to be in a kind of version of IAAC in the United States, at least in the kind of technological equipment and the Autodesk kind of like build space that they allow me every single material and every single machine to pretty much do anything. I was even putting a log in this kind of like big milling machine to kind of create this kind of French sitting style into the logs, and try to really create an installation that could show that design is much more than the finished object, but should incorporate all these kind of productive landscapes that make them possible in the first place. So with that image, and again, thanking you all for the time, I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you, Danny. Thank you for a lovely and inspiring talk from the molecular to the ecological, the metabolic of the ERMAM, the built environments, and everything that surrounds the way that we interact in buildings and cities. I think this is fundamental. We have a couple of minutes for few questions from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture, super interesting. I think you presented a very ambitious and sort of beautiful proposal of the future of the planet's carbon atmosphere if we were to adopt this vision of this whole economy of mass timber. But architects can be advocates for this, but if the biggest developers and contractors are not comfortable with building in these materials, it will never happen at that scale. So what can we do to get those groups to become advocates for the vision?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. In my work, mostly with the World Bank, I spend pretty much my time trying to convince governments into how to implement certain policies that helps to get there. But of course, policy is not the only way. There are many, I would say, many levers that one can move in order to get there, right? One lever is for sure policy. You have Macron saying like, if you want, the French Republic to pay for social housing, it has to be done with renewable materials, natural materials, mass timber, full stop. That's one way, right? You have other ways of people saying like, well, maybe, it's a cultural demand, people wants to be living in warm, natural kind of materials. I mean, last 2 years ago, IKEA did a kind of survey in young people accessing for the first time housing. What were their top priorities? And you would expect like, okay, cost, is that the only thing they care? No, actually one of the highest criteria for them was precisely the ecological impact. They want to be living in a healthy environment that, it's not contributing to kind of climate change. So that's another lever, like people starting to demand things. If you could choose to live in a concrete building versus a mass timber building, maybe you want to live in the ecological. So again, that's another level, the cultural one. People maybe starting to demand that. Then there are like, several others, like I think architects will also have a role. I mean, like what we are doing, what we are trying to do with the prototypes we do here at IAAC or the different initiatives. So the book publication is also creating a form of awareness, of pedagogy, of culture of that this is possible. Because if not, there are some barriers that, people don't understand. People still think that, building with mass timber will be decremental for the forest. And if done properly, it's quite the opposite. That will activate and probably generate more surface and more, areas of production. So again, obviously there are many, there are like the lever of kind of like incentives, the lever of the actual industries that could help to make this change. In the US, they have been, very vocal about, putting efforts kind of like together to make the change. So, and developers, if the demand starts to show up, they will be the first one to go. I was recently here with fantastic guys that I met recently. They have opened up a new and promoting company that they only want to do CLT buildings. They know this is what is coming. They know this is the future and they want to be ahead of the rest. And this is kind of like happening. So again, it's never easy. The transition always finds resistance, especially for those in power, meaning other materialities that they are happy the way things are. But I think there are many ways, and I think it's a matter of time. I don't think we have much more alternatives, unfortunately, at least in this particular way.
Okay. Yeah.
Ooh.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. Super nice. My head is kind of buzzing with a lot of ideas and questions. And I wanted to ask something that I struggle with myself a lot personally, because I think you opened up a new regime of metabolic design that certainly differs, in a huge way from our current system. And I often think, could that new regime exist within the sort of market-based logic we have now? Or is that the sort of first thing we have to confront? Like, can we slip this in without noticing to the way that it's going and sort of without having too much of a quote unquote revolution, kind of change our metabolics for the good? Or is that the sort of primary barrier of unchecked growth and neocolonialism, these kind of paradigms? Is that how much of a confrontation is there? I think your last slides really spoke to that a lot, but I wanted to have the chance to ask.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. That was better than I was expecting, so it's good. I mean, you are always the critical knife, which is super important, and I will always appreciate. But when I'm the one receiving the questions, I shake a little bit. Anyways, so maybe I will bring one of my recent readings, Andreas Malm. I don't know if anybody is familiarized. He has this book where basically, it's basically articulating the history since the Industrial Revolution on how we have gotten here, the point that we are. He has the kind of Marxist tradition of, let's say, not in the ideology, but really in using the framework to understand, how capitalism unfolds, and, if these kind of more progressive ecological forms of building are compatible with the current, predominant kind of like system. The beautiful thing I like about him, as opposed to most Marxist scholars, that they will all, always tell you like, yeah, we have to go for revolution, blah, blah, blah. That's the only way to, trigger social change. Again, I'm not in that boat, personally, but I like very much Malm, which he says that, the way to go forward is actually to start bringing those, developers, business-oriented, small entrepreneurs, that they embrace this, and through their own means of, of production, can start, triggering the change, which is basically, rather than say like, okay, all capitalists out, and this is about a completely new regime. That's very utopical. It's not going to happen. Malm, instead, I think he arrives to the same conclusion, but he's saying like, no, this will happen only if we are able to shift the economy, to make an economy out of this, to explain that, building with less carbon, with more ecological in the long run is good, and you allow them to actually get a profit out of what they are doing that is kind of like better. Of course, it's not as simple. It requires many other things, but I like, from a, let's say, more theoretical point of view, that kind of approach, because the other one we have seen, I mean, it's really not going, kind of like too far. We have been with neoliberalism for over the last 50 years. We have 4 good chances of, stopping neoliberalism and finding another way, the crisis of 2008 and many others, nothing has happened. Why? There is no alternative whatsoever unless we start to embracing this more smooth kind of change. So I hope this addresses the question, which is a fundamental one, but I do think it's possible. I don't think it's a finding an alternative to a gradual alternative to the way capitalism has unfolded, might still persist, but again, in different ways with under different criteria. So anyways, that's my optimistic take on it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Danny. I think one of the interesting aspects of timber is also the added value in relation to the aesthetics that you were discussing. So this could create a different culture for people in what they ask. It creates a kind of a much more domestic space. And last but not least, I think that also, like taking into consideration that that the construction sector is one of the largest waste generator. If we start thinking that our built panorama will be replaced by more natural or let's say materials that they could go back to where we have harvested them without making any bad. I think that is also like a very important thing in order to close the circle of the destination of the material of the building as well. So thank you for narrating us to that. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and have a good evening. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.